So last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Genevieve Guenther, who is joining us from New York. Genevieve is affiliate faculty at the New School, where she sits on the advisory board of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, and also the founding director of media activism group End Climate Silence. She's also an expert reviewer of the contribution of Working Group 3 on the mitigation of climate change for the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Trained as a Renaissance scholar, she writes about the role of language in the politics of the climate crisis. Announced earlier this week, her upcoming book, The Language of Climate Politics, will examine the ways in which oil and gas interests weaponize climate advocates' rhetoric to fight the enactment of green climate change policies, and show how Americans can talk about the climate crisis to help neutralize this. New York Times Magazine cited Genevieve's work with End Climate Silence as helping to set climate politics on fire. At the organization, she pushes the news media to start talking about the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves, and link global warming to extreme weather, foregrounding its role in news about politics, energy business and finance, immigration, real estate, health, travel and food, and even the arts. Genevieve has been nominated for an EcoAmerica Climate Leadership Award. She will talk to us about how we need to revamp the ways we think and talk about the climate crisis to mobilize action. Over to you, Genevieve.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Daniel. And thank you for having me today. It's an incredible honor to share the stage with Bill and Wolfgang. I am not even close to as eloquent as those gentlemen are, so I'm not going to speak extemporaneously. I've actually written something out for you, but I am going to use my approach to climate communication, which merges the psychological and sociological research with Renaissance and classical theories of rhetoric and how storytelling produces action, to suggest certain frames that not only journalists, but storytellers in the media more broadly might be able to use to help mobilize the concerned into action. And before I get started, I just want to clarify that I'm going to be talking about communication that is directed to that vast majority of people who are already concerned about the climate crisis, but who have not yet been mobilized to join the climate movement in whatever way feels meaningful for them. I think that it's a much more important task, actually, for thought leaders to try to mobilize those people into action than to try to persuade deniers to accept the science of climate change, or even to sort of get the disengaged to care about the crisis, because I don't think there's any communication that can really overcome the effects of coordinated right-wing media disinformation and right-wing media cues. And so, having tracked how the language of climate politics play out, I think that the best chance of moving our politics forward is to mobilize the concerned in order to create electoral consequences for the center. Because if you look at how people talk about the climate crisis, the center is currently allied with the right on this issue. And so our best chance is to create electoral consequences for politicians who style themselves as being in the center. All right, so that all said, I'm now going to begin to talk about how we speak and talk about the climate crisis to mobilize these concerned people. To do this, we need to tell the story of climate change, not as a science story, but as a human story. I mean, I think journalists are sort of unthinkingly telling climate change as a human story, but the problem is they're currently representing the climate crisis as a tragedy. So tragedy is a kind of story, a genre in the parlance of literary criticism that has very deep roots in Western culture, and that most of us recognize and respond to, whether we're conscious of it or not. So the form of tragedy goes something like this. A hero has some amazing qualities that make him extraordinary, but those very qualities also give him a kind of blindness. And in that blindness, he makes a fatal mistake that leads to his death and the death of the culture that he represents. So in the original tragedy, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus has the boldness to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, thereby saving Thebes from plague and becoming its king, but his boldness also leads him to unwittingly murder his father and marry his mother, which brings a new plague down on the city, which dissipates only once Oedipus recognizes what he's done, gouges out his own eyes, and sends himself into exile. So that recognition of the mistake, of the flaw, is a crucial element of tragedy. The hero eventually realizes that he's made a terrible error, but he realizes this when it's too late to fix the problem that he's created. So how does this genre play out with respect to the climate crisis? Well, to my mind, all too often journalists, writers of fiction, and even some climate advocates frame climate change as a tragedy. Humanity in this story has a Promethean power to use technology to transcend the limits of nature, but this power has consequences we didn't imagine. It's causing the twin climate and ecological crises. And so what we need to do now is wake everybody up and collectively recognize the fatal consequences of our actions. But increasingly, it seems like this recognition is coming too late. Emissions are continuing to rise while the world sleeps, and we're careening off a cliff into the abyss of apocalyptic runaway global heating. So this story resonates, right? I mean, even Greta Thunberg talks about needing to wake people up. The story sounds intuitively correct, at least on some level. To my mind, however, I think the story is wrong. Although it is true that most Americans, at least, don't understand how dangerous climate change will be to the children who are currently growing up right now, and how necessary it is that governments lead the decarbonization of our economy without any delay, I would actually argue that enough people, and certainly enough people in power, actually do understand these things. And they're not taking adequate action, not because they don't understand or because they haven't recognized or woken up, but because they don't want to lose their access to money or loosen their hold on power. As Bill recently said in his newsletter, which is extremely excellent and to which you all must subscribe, changing the world with climate communication is not actually about raising awareness with data and reason, but encouraging people to engage in a fight over money and power. And the genre of story that best does this, according to literary critics and philosophers stretching all the way back to Aristotle, is the epic. So the epic is a sweeping tale of a hero who bands together with a small group of fighters to overcome life and death challenges and renounce exquisite temptations in order to overthrow a corrupt regime and found a new world. This kind of story also has deep resonances in Western culture. From David, who uses his cunning to topple Goliath, to Aeneas, who tears himself away from Dido in order to continue his journey towards the founding of Rome, to the band of rebels in Star Wars who collect a coalition of misfits to topple this evil empire, to the leather and vinyl-clad punks in the Matrix who have unplugged themselves from the system and devoted their lives to taking down the machines. There are copious examples to draw from when you're assembling stories to inspire people to join the fight to end the fossil fuel economy. Now, I mean, all my examples are American, of course, but the Tolkien books, for example, are also in this genre. So the epic inspires two big emotions that can help mobilize people into action. The first is outrage, or moral shock, as it's known in the social science literature. And the second is a desire for a new world. I'll talk about these emotions and then end with a final bit of advice about turning epic storytelling into climate communications practice. So first, to help produce outrage, and also just to be accurate in the way that we talk about the climate crisis, keep your storytelling focus on people. Too often, communicators, journalists, novelists, everybody represent climate change as a disembodied force that we should fight directly, as if we were fighting climate change. But in reality, we must fight the people in power who are supporting the fossil fuel economy and blocking decarbonization. The climate crisis is not caused by human nature, but by some humans in power. And every epic has its extraordinary villains. And I promise you, once you start talking about the climate crisis as a conflict between people over money and power, you will have no trouble finding villains for your narrative. But to ensure your stories about climate villains really do produce that kind of moral shock and outrage that can mobilize people into action, you also need to make the consequences of what these people are doing as clear and vivid and personal as possible. You need to talk about these things with energeia, as the Renaissance poets would say, with a kind of electricity and vividness. So you could describe having your home repeatedly inundated with water from torrential downpours over and over until the mold seeps in and the foundations start to sag and you have to move whether you can afford it or not. Or you could describe hunger gnawing at your ribs as you try to sleep because multiple bread baskets have failed due to high heat and drought, and market shelves have been empty for months on end. Or, as Kim Stanley Robinson does so brilliantly in his novel, The Ministry of the Future, which Bill alluded to earlier, you could narrate what it feels like to suffer a scorching heat wave that over the course of a week kills millions of people, many of whom are slowly cooked to death in a hot lake where they've tried to take refuge. Stories like these, which enable people to imagine suffering global heating in their own bodies, make clear and visceral the horror of what the people blocking decarbonization are doing to us and our children. Now, these stories are scary, but climate change itself is scary. I mean, when I read scientific studies, I'm very often shot through with bolts of fear. Now, for many years, climate communicators were told not to scare people, rather to sugarcoat their stories, because the social science research seemed to show that fear made people disengage, fall into a kind of doomism, or just sort of turn away. But if you examine the social science research carefully, you'll discover that it's only in isolation that fear is demotivating. When frightening stories are told to people who are already concerned about the crisis, and when those scary stories are paired with messages that bring the people causing the crisis into view, such stories help produce the outrage that mobilizes people into action. So fear is the energy, as it were, and outrage is the machine that metabolizes that energy and propels people into action. But then, of course, the question arises, action towards what? So part of this epic storytelling will involve laying out a vision of the new decarbonized world that people can begin to long for, quite aside from their longing for pure survival. And arguably, this vision has not really emerged yet. We still need to create it. But, that's what you're all here for. And the good news is that you don't need to be a futurist to begin to delineate what will be wonderful about a decarbonized world. Anyone who cares about language can help. Even just using a slightly different vocabulary can begin to make a decarbonized world visible to the imagination and desirable. So, for example, many climate communicators try to overcome disinformation or even just people's legitimate worries about the cost of decarbonization by citing the even higher costs of not acting on the climate crisis. The strategy, I think, is a missed opportunity to get people actively excited about net zero, but real net zero decarbonization. Rather, we should turn people's attention away from the pain of spending money towards the financial benefit of decarbonizing. For if you compile the economics research, you'll see that a decarbonized economy will actually make the vast majority of people more prosperous. They'll save literally thousands of dollars a year in electricity, heating, and at least in the US, healthcare bills, which will raise their real income significantly. Now, I know this sounds implausible almost, but that's because the way we have used the word cost to talk about the cost of climate change has normalized the idea that climate action will be felt in the wallet, when in reality, the cost of climate action will be socially distributed, while its tremendous benefits will be personal and palpable. So I will talk about this more in my book, and I'm sort of scooping myself here, but I promise you I will bring receipts there. I'm just going to lay out the recommendation now. At any rate, that's what I think solutions journalism should be in the epic frame, not just reports about new technologies that might replace fossil fuels, because I don't really think that most people care about objects and machines. I think solutions journalism should talk about the parts of decarbonization that will make most people's lives better, even just in the next decades. Indeed, something devoutly to be wished. And that is the world that people in the climate movement are fighting for. And that is what climate communicators need to talk about. So in sum, people in power are putting our children in danger. They are destroying the conditions for the only life in the known universe. And so what we need to do as people who care about life on this planet, we need to remove those people from power and replace them with climate champions who will lead the transition into a decarbonized world without delay. That will require us to band together collectively, overcome great obstacles, use our cunning and strength to topple mighty adversaries, and drink deeply from our well of love and duty in order to build something beautiful. So I'm here today to say, when you're talking about climate change, let's also start talking about that beautiful world and help bring it into being.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. Any questions for Genevieve from the audience? I can start us off with one. So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you would talk not about those who are not yet converted. You would talk about the ones who are converted but need to be mobilized into action. And in reality, media companies often face this tension of having to serve those audiences, the ones who already understand that something needs to happen and might just not be doing anything about it yet, but also trying to bring those into the fold that don't yet understand and don't yet know about this problem. And they've started to do some interesting experiments around using sports, for example, and talking about it as part of a Premier League match. Obviously, the way you communicate to that kind of audience is different to from the way you communicate to an audience that is already converted. So would you want to share your wisdom with us on how to talk to them?
Sure. So the thing that's important to remember, as I said in the beginning, is that really there's no communication that can overcome the coordinated, outrageously funded network of disinformation that is influencing the people who are disengaged with the climate crisis and influencing the people who still don't understand that this crisis is humans caused and that we need to solve it immediately. So in the United States, at least, there was a survey that came out recently that showed Republicans, the people on the right wing of our politics, are increasingly climate deniers to a degree that they have never been before. So in fact, this kind of journalism that is pointing towards extreme weather and trying to point to the facts of the case and get those facts out to the public is not helping at all to raise awareness among those populations, because the right-wing media, as the legitimate media gets better at representing climate change, is doing even more to circulate denialist talking points and to put people on air who cue that if you're a Republican, you must believe that climate change is fake news. So the way to appeal to these people to the degree that we can is not to try to present them with more facts and more data or even more well-told stories. It's to try to show that there are people on the right wing who already accept the reality of the crisis, and so that they can safely change their opinion about the climate crisis without feeling like they need to exile themselves from their communities, from their social contexts, from their own sense of identity and political community. So this is a very challenging thing, at least in the United States, because there really aren't that many right-wingers who acknowledge the reality of the climate crisis and are embracing the solutions. So, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, is a kind of wonderful crossover figure who identifies as a Republican, but who is also, kind of a quasi-climate activist. However, United States politics has been so incredibly polarized that I don't even know if Arnold Schwarzenegger codes as a right-winger anymore, but still, you would need to kind of collect these people and have them speak out about what they're doing to show themselves as a kind of example that other people can imitate and also sort of, hide behind and take cover behind. So I would say if you're addressing these people directly, what you want to try to do is find common ground. You want to see if you share any kinds of values together. And most people, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum, care about their children, care about their children's future, really, work hard to give their children a better life than the one that they had. So to me, that's always a good sort of common ground. And then from there, you can kind of connect the dots to the climate crisis and how this puts their children and all of our children's future into doubt. But again, what you're trying to do here is to just give them the idea that it might be safe to their own sense of self and to their own sense of social community to acknowledge the reality of the climate crisis. I think if you can do that, you've actually done great work, and you shouldn't really expect any more. But again, as I said in the beginning, I don't think that, especially with the timeline for decarbonization that we're facing, I don't actually think the political challenge is to try to, quote unquote, convert those people from climate denial to accepting the climate crisis and then kind of mobilizing them into action. I think that that is too many steps, and it's not even necessary anyway, because the problem is, as I said, is that the center is allied with the right. We're not going to be able to bring the right to the left, but we might be able to drive a wedge between the right and the center by creating electoral consequences for people in the center who are voting to, or rewriting legislation to prevent decarbonization. And the way that we do that, I would argue, is by mobilizing people who are concerned to make climate their top issue and to get them to join the climate movement in whatever way feels meaningful to them.
Thank you. So what I heard there was it's about, because this is also linked to individual sense of identity, it's about talking to these people with authentic representations, people who look like them, who think like them, and can convince them that it's okay to change their beliefs from what seems to be the paradigm. And that's something I think we'll talk about in the next session with Serena. I can see a couple of hands going up in the room. Yeah, Jeremy?
Hi there, Jeremy from ITV, which is a broadcaster here in the UK. Hi, I'm really interested in your knowledge and expertise on the Renaissance era, actually, because I spent a lot of time working with program makers and editorial people over the last few years across different channels, trying to explain the context of what's going on here. And the more you talk about it, the more you realize that the degree of change, the scale of change that we are living through right now is massive. And the only reference that I can find of this kind of the magnitude, it might be the Renaissance era, actually, where you're talking about the change in, economic systems, political systems, culture. Everything around us is going through a degree of transition, and the philosophy behind it, from potentially, in the past thinking about, maybe the Renaissance, one of the key lessons was putting man above nature and above everything else, whereas now maybe we're entering a phase where we put humans at the heart or along nature. So I'm interested in, I'm not talking about the tactical, but how we how we bring these people or that people on board here. I'm interested in your learning and your reflection on how to live through an era like that, and what can we learn from the Renaissance to understand the degree of change that we may be living through right now. Just a small question.
Well, I think that the similarities are absolutely there, as you note. The change from a medieval culture to a modern culture that took place over, I would say, 100 or 200 years during the Renaissance was really remarkable. At the end of it, you have, a significant secularization of the culture. You have the beginning of capitalism. Europeans have spread across the globe. It's the idea of the place of planet Earth in the universe has been completely transformed. Culturally, it is a massive shift. On the other hand, I think the Renaissance was one of the most optimistic historical periods in Western history, where it seemed finally that ideas and beauty and new trade routes and travel and everything we think of as sort of the benefits of modernity could really transform people's lives and do much to kind of free human beings from this sense of sinfulness that they had struggled with for most of the medieval period, and also free them from being kind of admired in the material world. So the sort of typical Renaissance text is this Oration on the Dignity of Man by Pico della Mirandola. And what he says that makes man special, and I use man advisedly because women were considered not quite human and they were slightly below men on the hierarchy of this chain of being. But he said that what made men special was that they were right at the center of the universe. We had God on the top and then the angels, and then you had sort of rocks and plants and animals below. But man kind of spanned the gap between the transcendent and the material, and thus he was able to range across all of creation with a freedom that rivaled the gods. So, and I think this sort of optimistic idea of humanity has kind of motivated much of our, or not motivated necessarily, but certainly justified much of our technological system and our extractivist economy, this idea that we can use our intelligence and use our vision to, you know, pull resources from the earth and deploy them at our will. So to me, I feel like that is something that needs to be deeply, deeply critiqued as we move into this next phase of humanity's tenure on this planet. And it needs to be reworked to help us understand how imbricated and how entwined we are in nature. And that in fact, this kind of division that we've created between the natural and the artificial world doesn't really apply. Like, if you think about it, our plastics are actually nature. Our airplanes are nature. Our books are nature. All of the objects and the technologies that we've developed as they are changing the climate have revealed themselves to be actually expressions of nature. So this kind of binary thinking that, you know, there's the material world and then there's the transcendent world, and humanity can bridge the gap between the two of them needs to be abandoned. And we need to understand ourselves as always imbricated in the material world. So I agree that the Renaissance offers us a model of some kind of large-scale historical change, at least on a very long timeline that we don't actually have the luxury of enjoying. But I think also that the ideas that were developed in the Renaissance and then that circulated into the advent of capitalism need to be deeply critiqued and reworked in order for us to understand what our new place on this planet might be, and to come up with new cultures and new rituals that allow us to feel connected to each other and to feel connected to transcendence without feeling like we have to deny our natural materiality, as it were. I hope that suffices as some kind of answer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Genevieve. We've probably run out of time for any further questions. It's been an absolute honor to share the stage with you, with Wolfgang, and with Bill. So thank you, all three of you, very much for joining us today. I think you deserve a big round of applause.